Hello everyone, this is Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School. Today's video, we are going to make a case for the Knight e4 Budapest defense. We shall show you the moves leading up to this. It is a Queen's Gambit defense, so d4, Knight f6, c4, the main move in the position, and e5. This leads to the Budapest Gambit. After the pawn captures the pawn, we shall play knight to e4 rather than the usual and regular knight to g4. This move is less popular than knight g4. Also, in many of these lines, the computer gives an assessment of favorable to white. So we're going to hopefully try to make a case for this move, and hopefully it will be a great weapon that you can use in your own games. This move is not any less tactical than knight to g4. One of the only reasons why it is less popular is the fact that black does not collect the e5 pawn fairly easily, although there will be lines, as we will see, where white will just simply give this pawn back. One of the benefits to knight to e4 is the fact that the pawn on e5 still exists, so therefore black actually has pawn breaks in the form of f6 or d6, and when white captures either one of these pawns, it will open a couple of extra files for black. For example, taking on d6 will open the e and d files. Taking on f6 will open the e and f files, which will give black some extra counterplay later. In those particular lines, black will be down a pawn permanently, but will have great development and good attacking chances. Okay, so the first thing we shall do is look at the pieces from right to left and explain, generally speaking, what these pieces will do in this particular opening. The A pawn typically will either stay home on a7, if it is not needed. It will rarely go to a6, usually in the lines where the queen gets trapped. On the queen's side, as we will see later, the pawn will go to a6, but the only other function that it has will go to a5 in many lines. This move will either attack a pawn that will already be on b4, it will prevent a pawn from going to b4, or it will secure black the c5 square by making a pawn that's on b4 moving to b5, as we will see later. The rook behind it will either support this particular maneuver, or it will most probably go to the square d8, either through queenside castling, or once black castles short, then the rook is just simply moved to d8. In some cases, when the lines on the king side get opened up, the rook can easily go to e8 and sometimes f8. The pawn on b7 in a couple of our lines will actually go to b6. This will secure the c5 square even more, and it will make room for a bishop to b7. Very rarely will the pawn go to b5. Only in tactical situations, or possibly situations where white will castle queenside, would we ever play b5. Other than that, the pawn will stay at home, just simply guarding the light squares on the queen side. The knight on b8 most usually will go to the c6 square if white does not guard this particular square. In the lines where this b pawn ends up on b5, we will have a much more difficult time developing this knight. So in those cases, this is where the knight will most often be developed on d7 once we move the d pawn. Once the knight gets to d7, it will have some greener pastures to go to later on, as we shall see. The c pawn usually affords no particular function in this particular opening except for protection for a king that happens to castle queenside. The c pawn is rarely used in this line. It almost never goes to c5, almost never goes to c6. It just simply sits here and guards these squares. In a couple lines, this pawn will actually be sacrificed to open up more lines on the queen side, as we shall see. The light bishop is actually one of the better pieces in this particular opening. This bishop on b6 will go to b7. In the lines where we end up playing d6 or d5, this bishop will have a whole host of squares that they can go to, and is a very flexible piece. So we like the light bishop here. The d pawn will either go to d5 to protect the knight in some lines. In some lines, we will play d6 and offer a real gambit where white will capture back and black will be a pawn down permanently. And the function of moving the d pawn also is to help out with the development of the queenside pieces. The queen, more often than not, will go to the e7 square once the dark bishop is developed. There are some cases where we can play queen h4. There will be times when either of the pawn breaks that occur in this opening that we will capture back with a queen when white captures, and this will bring out the queen to one of these squares on the king side or in the center. The dark bishop also is very flexible, and you would think with the knight on e4 that we would be playing bishop c5, playing for mate, but in many cases we will not do this because playing bishop to c5 will just be met by e3, and there is in fact no mating attack and no way to enforce that. The more usual spot for the bishop is b4 with check, or when it pins something to the king in Nimzo Indian fashion. So the bishop, in many of our lines, the bishop will go to b4. In some of our lines, the bishop will go to g7 when the g pawn moves, and the bishop will make pressure on to the e5 square. Only, I would assume, in really strange circumstances would we ever put the bishop on c5 if white weakened their king in some way. The other place for the bishop will be d6 if in the lines where black plays d6 and white captures back and we end up taking with the bishop, and the bishop on d6 will command a large number of squares. So this d6, b4, or g7 is the usual place for the dark bishop. The knight on e4 serves the valuable function of simply being the closest thing to the white army and attacks a number of decent squares. Usually this knight will either be exchanged for something on the d2 square, or it will run back to c5 only to perch itself on e6 as a good blockading square, commanding a number of squares from e6. So those are the usual two functions of the knight. The king will either be castled short or castle long. If in cases where the king needs to run, usually going to the F file, either on F7 or F6, is the safest place for the king to go if you need to hand castle or to run around with your king. But in some cases, they will castle long, some cases they will castle short. The F pawn is usually exchanged off on F6 if need be, or in some cases it will go to F5. In one line, we will see this move in order to protect the knight on E4. Otherwise, Freddie just stays home and protects the king. The G pawn actually has two possible functions. One is to play G6, which will usually make room for a bishop to G7, which will attack the E5 pawn and also create chances of making a great house for the king on the king side. In ultra-violent variations, this pawn will sometimes go to g5. The purpose of this is to continue on to g4, usually attacking a knight on f3. If white happens to castle in this direction, then g5 is the start of a pawn storm. Otherwise, the pawn will, Gary will also stay at home and guard the kingside squares. So in fact, it actually has three different functions. The H pawn, same thing. It can stay here and guard a king and just keep the king side under control. In some cases, we can use the pawn coming to H5, especially with the G pawn help, and we have a pawn storm on the king side. The H8 rook is either castled on the king side, or if black manages to castle queen side, a lot of times this rook will either stay at h8 and support the h pawn's movements, or it will go to e8 and attack in the center of the board. All right, so now these, of course, are all general considerations of the pieces. Let's actually see some lines in action here. Now, the first lines that we shall look at involve queen moves. White has three queen moves, c2, d4, and d5 that are typically played. I would assume that other queen moves can be played like b3 and a4 and d3, but the most popular of the queen moves are these three squares here. So we shall look at these moves in turn. Now, for all of these queen movements, I am going to recommend bishop to b4 check. So whichever way the queen moves, we play bishop to b4 check. Obviously, we would not have this move if they play something like queen b3 or a4, but these moves are not as popular, so I will not cover them here. If you happen to face this type of move, I am fairly certain that developing the knight normally and attacking the pawn and actually supporting bishop to b4 check must be fairly good for black and will just lead to just normal development where white has misplaced their queen. All right, so the first move we shall look at is queen to c2. Which of the queen moves, this move looks like it makes the most sense because not only does it attack the knight, but it also sticks around the queen side long enough to help white develop the rest of their pieces and also defend the queen side. All right, so like I said, all queen moves are met by bishop to b4 check. Now, this particular line, white has 4 moves, including king to d1, which of course is met by knight takes f2 mate. So of course, if we can get that, that's wonderful, but no one's ever going to fall for that. So they can actually block the check in 3 separate ways, with bishop to d2, knight to d2, knight to c3. Okay, so on the basic move, knight to c3, just developing and attacking the e knight twice. And here we're, of course, threatening queen takes, we're being threatened with queen takes knight. Then the correct move here is just to simply play d5. This not only protects the pawn, protects with the pawn on e4, but it also makes room for this move bishop to f5 in some cases, which is going to make the queen on c2 rather uncomfortable. Now, even in this position, white has a couple of different moves that they can play. Number one is to simply en passant. En passant, this again undermines the protection of the e4 knight. And here, again, we should play bishop to f5, not only reinforcing this, but threatening some possible discovery upon the queen. If white keeps chomping away and takes on c7, this is one of the cases where Charlie, the c-pawn, actually disappears, we could just simply capture back and then either look to castle or to develop the knight and castle long, and black should have extremely good development for the pawns that were sacrificed here. And also because of the fact that black has got a pin and he's got disco powers on the queen and open files. This should be more than good enough compensation for the 2 pawns. Even if white makes a move like queen to a4 to try to attack the bishop, we have a good developing move, and white is way behind on development and is in danger of actually being on the wrong side of a brilliancy here. Okay, so we don't have, en passant is met by bishop to f5. If white just simply develops with knight to f3, we can just simply develop as well, like so. And if white just tries to play solidly and again, just seeking to develop and castle, then black has the move bishop to g4. With castling on the short side in mind, again with a very rapidly developed position. I will stop the line here. In my opinion, black has got good compensation for the pawn in this position. There was a very famous game, what was it, Stoll Trappel, from the late 1980s, where black won a very quick and brilliant game with this particular move. And in my opinion, black already has good compensation, even if the computers say that white is slightly for choice here. I think a lot of human beings would not be able to handle this position properly. That's just my opinion. I mean, I can't really prove that, but hopefully you guys can prove that by just simply using this line. All right, so let's back up a couple of moves. Now, after the d5 move, white also can capture the pawn. Now, on this one, we should capture back, so we are still down a pawn. And after the move bishop to d2, because of the fact that the knight is now unpinned, we will have to exchange off. This is actually one of the other strategies that black can use in the Fajarowicz, is just to simply exchange a couple of pieces, even the queen, and get a very playable endgame. Here is one such line. In this position, black can actually, to get out of the fact that the knight is attacking the queen, is simply exchange the queens. Take, 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 king takes, and then develop a piece and attack the pawn. And in one particular game, white just simply developed and defended, and black just simply developed and attacked, and black already has an equal position here. Castling with check followed by rook to e8 will rapidly centralize the pieces. White will just simply remove the guard at some point and win their pawn back and have a perfectly good endgame to play. Black will also have a majority of 3 versus 2 on the queen side. Black will have, especially in lines where black will capture here, black will have a 4 versus 3 on the king side, but his majority will be crippled. So this will give blacks a very good endgame to play for the win with. So that is queen to c2. Let's back up a few moves. Okay, so now another move, this move, queen d4, was recommended by Tartakower himself, who actually liked to play this gambit with the black pieces and thought a lot about queen to d4. However, this move should also be met by bishop to b4 check. Now, here, white again has 3 general ways to block. I was always wondering about king to d1 because f2 is now covered, so knight takes f2 isn't on. But it turns out that just simply guarding this knight with pawn to f5 should give black some good counterplay. Bishop c5 is now the threat. And of course, if white captures with en passant, then black can take back with the knight. Like so. And this will give white a permanent pawn advantage, but now black has got open E and F files and also can develop the pieces rather smoothly. Knight c6 is coming in by force. Castles will be a move. Moving the d pawn to either d6 or d5 is going to take advantage of the king d1. So even though I long ago wondered about king d1, it's not really a move that is going to give white anything special. It's just going to make their king weak. So we only have to worry about blocks here. Okay, so the first block will be bishop to d2. Now, usually in these situations, when we have the pieces on knight e4 and b4 like this, and they first block the check with the bishop, we should almost always take this guy. This will win us the bishop pair temporarily, and it will allow us to develop our pieces in relative peace. So we should capture. They should capture back with the knight, of course, and then we just simply play knight to c6, followed by queen to e7. Knight c6 is a free move. Pretty much no matter where the queen moves, the next move is queen to e7, piling up on the e pawn. Of course, in some cases, white can actually defend the pawn with knight f3 or pawn to f4, but this possibly does not actually matter. So, for example, queen to e3, we can play queen to e7 already. Now, on knight gf3, in some cases, we can actually just simply take on d2 right away. If the queen captures, then we could play knight takes e5, getting our pawn back and having a perfectly reasonable late middle game. If they, of course, take with the knight, then we can still take on e5 with either piece. And if they take with the king, well, this, of course, holds on to e5, but again, it puts the king in terrible danger. Quite possibly a queen b4 check will be unpleasant. Black can also simply castle, and then put possibly the rook on d8 or e8 and pile up on the e5 pawn. And white will have some problems not only developing the pieces, but getting their king into safety. Okay, so that's what happens if they block it with the knight. Now, if they block it with the bishop, if they block it with the knight, then we can also capture once and play knight c6 as our free developing move. And again, when the queen moves, we can take on d2 and play queen to e7 once again. This again will attack e5 a couple of times, and it will also threaten queen to b4. This should also give black a very playable middle game, and or what we could say a late middle game, since we are exchanging a few pieces. So even this one we don't have to worry about. And then the last one is knight to c3. Now this one is interesting because here, very much like the Nimzo Indian, where black has pressure on the c3 knight, in this particular case, we do not take it with the bishop, but we take it with the knight. Now, this wins a tempo on our bishop, but of course, we can win a tempo back by playing knight to c6. And white only has really one move to try to protect both pawns, although queen to d2 is playable. And in these kind of cases, black should actually back up the bishop like this and keep the pressure on both of these pawns like this. The usual move that is played in this position is queen to e3, holding on to both pawns. And this is actually one of the most trickiest positions in the Fajarowicz Budapest, because it seems like that, of course, we have to retreat the bishop, but it seems like that if we retreat the bishop back to a5 like this, that this gives white a really good move in the form of bishop to a3, blocking out castling. Also, the pawn breaks that we would like to play are no longer playable, because when it captures, it's going to be with check, which is going to win white quite a few pawns if it's done like this. So this actually looks like it's a really bad position for black, except for the fact that black has a very unusual resource in the form of a very long queen move in queen to h4. This move simply threatens the c4 pawn. And of course, if we could play queen to c4, then there will be a massive double attack on the c3 pawn. And this also gives black, I suppose, a square on d8 if you need to run away. But this move here actually gives black a lot of compensation. And in fact, black even has a better position here. So this is one of these rare kind of moves in this line that should be known, since this position can basically be forced, especially after the queen d4 line. If white guards the check with knight to c3, then this position is actually forced. Take, knight c3, queen e3, bishop to a5, and if white plays bishop to a3, we can actually do this, queen to h4, and have some marvelous counterplay here. Okay, so this leaves queen to d5, which is a move that probably will be explored a little bit more in the future. This one is a little bit trickier to meet. We should, of course, meet it with bishop to b4 check. But here, when white guards the check, in this one, because white is not guarding the queen side with the queen, that means that only knight d2 and bishop to d2 are the playable moves to get out of check. Knight d2 is an interesting move because of the fact that, again, we're attacking the e4 square twice, but here, capturing on d2, black will not win a tempo on the d5 queen with knight c6. Knight c6 will just be a simple developing move. So here, I suppose we could still keep capturing on d2 a couple of times and then play the usual knight c6 followed by queen to e7. Black can also play pawn to f5 here, holding on to the knight. And in this particular case, if white chooses to play en passant, since this undermines the knight, we could just simply capture here, and black has good compensation. Incidentally, if white finds queen to e5 check, this is one of those cases where if we cannot castle with the king, we should go to the f file. And here, playing king to f7 will prepare rook to e8, and then we can hand castle on to g8. And again, we're winning tempi on the fact that the queen has been developed, and we can attack the queen. So f5 is a good, reasonable play, a reasonable move in addition to exchanging twice on d2 in the case of knight to d2. In the case of bishop to d2, Then again, once again, we should always capture this with the knight and win the bishop pair temporarily, even though we are usually going to capture back here and give the bishop pair back for all of those of you that loved the bishop pair. Knight c6 is a normal developing move, but it does no longer gains a tempo. So white can now make a normal developing move like knight to f3. And here is where black will have some options. You can try to capture on d2. You can castle your king. This one, I'm recommending d6, which is, again, trying to pick on the queen with bishop to e6. If white keeps chomping away, pawn takes pawn, we play our bishop to e6 move. White can win another pawn by taking the c pawn. We have to capture back, and white has the move either queen to e4 or queen to g5. Queen g5 is the normal move. This actually blocks out queenside castling, but it does not block out kingside castling. And in this position, white is up 2 pawns, but is very much behind in development. And in addition to that, his pieces are pinned, and black can easily put rooks into the center, either on the E, D, and C files, and have really great compensation once again for these 2 pawns. It would be very interesting to see if a human would be able to defend against this position adequately, even in blitz chess or even in regular tournament chess. Okay, so that it will conclude the queen moves. All right, so now there's 3, okay, there's basically 5 other moves here. A couple of them are not very popular. One of them, the reason why it is not popular is because it is losing, and that is f3. What happens if they just attack our knight right away and force us to do something with this guy? Now, we could play bishop to b4 check and try to exchange a couple pieces on d2. That's certainly possible. But the big problem, of course, with pawn to f3 is that it allows the fool's mate check, queen to h4. And here, white's only move is g3, and black's position is so good that they can also throw in bishop to b4 check, just to see if your opponent will want to commit harakiri right away by simply playing bishop to b4. And if they decide to block the check with bishop to d2, then we could play knight to takes g3, and I believe mate is unavoidable here. The reason why is that if white captures the knight, we could capture this with checkmate. That's fairly easy. If they capture our bishop, we just simply retreat with checkmate, guarding the d2 square. So therefore, the only move here is knight to c3 to avoid that, but then black will just simply play knight takes g3. And this is threatening knight take, it's threatening both knight takes rook check and knight to e4 with mate. So therefore, white should probably take this knight, and then we just simply take the rook, and black has a lot of extra material to start the game, and white does not have a good position here. So that's a losing move. Another move that you might run into is bishop to f4, which is a normal move in the knight g4 Budapest. So why wouldn't they play it here? The purpose of this is, of course, just to hold on to the e5 pawn. And again, here we can rely on our old friend bishop to b4 check. So then once they play knight to d2, here we can go for some more easier development. And then on knight to f3, I'll give you guys 2 choices here. One, and both of them have been played a couple times here at Lichess. One of them is just to simply play g5 and try to undermine the e5 knight by bouncing away all of the defenders. I would consider this to be extremely aggressive if you want to try that. The normal move here would be queen to e7 and developing normally and putting pressure on e5 with pieces here. Usually this type of move, queen to e7, what we're intending here is the ye old exchange on d2 a couple of times, take away the defenders, and then get our pawn back with knight takes pawn, which should give us a fairly normal position. Okay, so those moves being covered, we shall get to the 3 other main lines here. One of them is knight to f3. Another is knight to d2, Dr. Alekhine's move that he invented, and a3. Let's see. Let's go with knight to d2 first here. So Alexander Alekhine, former world champion, he invented this move. This is a very interesting idea based on if we go for the pin here, then the intention is to defend this knight and then kick the bishop with a3. This will hopefully eventually win the bishop pair. For example, something like knight c6, a3, and if capture, you can capture back with the knight. In some cases, you can also take back with the bishop, although this does give away the e-pawn. But the point is that after capture and giving away the pawn, white has some chances here with the bishop pair. Although even here, this is probably an equal position. And I would venture to guess that black doesn't really have too many problems in this position. We could still play queen to e7 and transpose back into earlier lines. So this is one of the ideas with knight to d2. But here, this is one of the rare cases where we're actually not going to capture on d2. If white has played knight to d2, that means that the dark square bishop has been trapped in. So in this position, instead of pinning on b4 and allowing white to unravel themselves, we are going to play knight to c5. Now, this is not going to be the permanent home of the knight. The home will hopefully be knight to e6, which will hit a number of nice squares on the all over the board. And here it is, generally speaking, the good line here for white is to kick the knight and gain queenside space, force black to go to this square. And as we can see here, black actually has a number of ideas that they're going to use. G6 or G5 on the king side. D6 is a possible move, just simply opening up the game with a pure pawn sacrifice. Pawn to A5 is going to hit the B pawn and force the pawn to do something. And pawn to B6 will actually help the light square bishop develop on B7. So these are several of the moves that are that we will look at here. So for example, if white plays a move like A3 and guards the pawn from the bishop attack, then A5 is an extremely good resource for black here, forcing the pawn to do something. Most probably, white is not going to capture this pawn and damage their queenside pawn structure permanently. And they're also not going to let you take this guy. So more likely, they're going to play b5. And this is where black actually gets even more resources. After b6, we have the resource of bishop to b7. We have the c5 square, which can be used with by a number of pieces, knight c5, bishop c5. This knight could possibly go to d7 and to c5. We also have the resource of g6 and putting the bishop on g7. In some cases, we will also have the resource g5 and starting some kingside business, also possibly with the bishop to g7. So this type of thing, I think, gives black good compensation for the pawn. So, and this is what happens if they play b4. Now, of course, if you put this position into the computer, it will say that white is slightly better because they are a pawn up. But because black has so many moves, I think this is what compensation is all about. You have a bunch of different moves and your opponent has some problems to deal with. Now, it is also possible that white can just simply develop normally with knight to f3. Knight f3, we can also develop normally. And generally speaking, here white has got three ways to try to develop the position. One is to play for g3 and try to develop the king side with bishop to g2 and castle. Another is to play e3 and develop the bishop on e2 and castle. Or you can try to play b3 at some point and put the bishop on b2, since the bishop is going to be trapped here on c1 for a little while. It makes sense to try to put the bishop on b2. Okay, so looking at b3 first, here, of course, we could try to break with f6 or d6 and just open the position, be a pawn down, but be able to develop our pieces really excellently. I think g5 is an interesting suggestion from Grandmaster Arthur Kogan, who is one of the great players of the Fajarowicz Budapest. I would also include Grandmaster Belon Lopez and International Master Yakov Norowitz, who is a great practitioner of this opening as well. G5, of course, is making room for a G4, which will try to undermine the protection of E5, and it makes room for bishop to G5, which will put additional pressure onto the pawn. It also does not get in the way of queen to E7, which will put even more pressure on the pawn. So this is a way to play against a B3. Now, of course, with bishop to B2 and bishop to G7, we will always have to be on the lookout for some tactics based on the fact that the bishops are looking at each other here. So we would have to pay attention to that. Now, if white plays G3 and tries to go for a bishop G2 and castle, here G5 doesn't really make too much sense because it's not likely that you're going to make any headway on the king side, even if you get your pawn to G4. So here I would say that G6 is a little bit more appropriate. Again, putting the bishop on G7, but not overly weakening the king side. I think also playable here is to play D6, and even after this capture, even taking with the queen or the bishop is acceptable, and just simply developing the pieces and utilizing the space that you have to play for tactics. On E3, I believe that black actually has all three choices. Once pawn to E3 has been committed, there is going to be no fianchetto, obviously, unless they want to play G3 later on. And so either G6 or playing G6 or D6 or G5 is all acceptable. Playing D6 and again trying to open up the position, playing G6 and trying to put the bishop on G7 is acceptable. Playing ultra violently with G5 is also fun. All three of these moves are playable here. So this is a great way and a very simple setup against the knight to D2 line. Okay, so that leaves the two lines left, which are knight F3 and A3. I will save A3 for last. A3 is probably the most popular move because A3 is the only move that physically stops bishop to B4 check or bishop to B4 with a pin of some kind. So then we have knight to F3. Okay, so even in this position, bishop to B4 check is still playable. Knight C6 is also playable. The line I want to make a case for is B6, and this is not an invention. This is a well-known move. The idea, of course, is to put the bishop on B7 and develop the pieces in some way that we've already talked about. Now, in these lines, white can play solidly here, or they can play ultra aggressively, and we will see how to handle both. Okay, so the ultra aggressive way and what looks like a tactical refutation of B6 is the move queen to D5. This immediately forks the knight on E4 and the rook on A8. So it looks like that we've just blundered and we're going to lose material. Once again, our bishop to B4 move comes in awfully handy, forcing white to block the check in some way. And so in this, so to show the possibilities here, white has two good ways to block the check. One is knight to D2 and the other one is bishop to D2. If knight to D2, in this line, we should actually protect our knight. And it seems like we should also protect our rook. Well, the only move that does that is actually bishop to B7. And here, of course, white could run away, but then black will actually have some good development and getting even more development in the next few moves. So what happens if white actually accepts our bishop sacrifice? Well, in this position, we have the move knight to C6, which actually creates a door for the queen, so the queen can't get back out again, and threatens knight to C5, which will actually trap the queen. Now, of course, they're not going to take on C6. So once they play knight C6, the threat is knight to C5. If in this position they play A6, queen to A6, then this is where we play knight to C5 to hit the queen, queen to B5, and even in this position, we have a nice little in-between move before we actually slam the door on the queen with pawn to A6, and that is actually just simply trading the bishop, take, and then simply A6, and this wins the queen. The queen has nowhere to go. Every square is taken up. Every square on this side of the board is protected. So this is one nice little trap that we have in this one. And if they guard this with the bishop, then once again, we should take the bishop as usual, take knight BD takes D2. And then here we have a chance to protect our rook with knight C6. After E3, queen E7, rook D1, bishop to B7, A3. So this, I mean, this is one of many moves here. Basically, black is going to build up on the E pawn by just simply castling long and rook HE8. This will hit the E5 pawn many times. After A3, it seems like that we should exchange the bishop for the knight as usual. It turns out here that white it could possibly be falling for another trap if black just simply castles. Now here it looks like that the bishop can be captured. However, after capturing, black can play knight takes pawn, and the bishop is protected, E4 is protected, F7 is protected, D3 is protected. If queen to D4, if the queen goes to D4, then knight C2 wins the queen. So this means that the only possible square is queen to B5. And in this position, black only needs to find one more move, and they end up winning, and that move is bishop to C6. Bishop C6 wins the queen. Queen can't go to check because of to A6 check because of knight takes queen. Can't go to A4. Can't go to A5. Can't capture the knight. Can't go anywhere. We win the queen. So this is a nice little trap that we can get into by sacrificing the bishop. But if they do not fall for this particular trick, then we could simply capture on D2, and we can easily play rook H to E8 and eventually collect our pawn back with a perfectly playable position. Perfectly playable. Okay, so let's back up to here. Queen to D5. Okay, so that's what happens if they actually play queen D5 and try to win the rook or the knight, that we actually have bishop to B4 check, and we have a couple of moves that not only set some traps, but will also give us a good position. Now, if white chooses to play more solidly here and just play a move like, say, knight BD2, or let's see. Yes. Okay. So they could easily play a move like knight BD2. Here we actually have several options. We can just simply play our bishop to B7 move and continue on developing normally. If they play A3 at some point, this will take away bishop to B4. We could play bishop to B4 now, as usual. We could also treat knight D2 like we did in the knight D2 variation and just simply back off with knight to C5 and eventually play knight to E6. This will allow us to play bishop to B7. This allows us all the normal play. Same thing on a move like E3. We could easily play bishop to B7. In this type of situation, we still have bishop to B4 check. We still have possibly G5. We possibly have G6. We also have D6. And by playing E3, of course, this again does not allow the dark square bishop to enter the game in any quick fashion. Okay. So that will cover knight to F3. So that will leave the final move, which is A3. Now, A3 takes away the bishop to B4 resource. So we have to do this in develop the dark square bishop in a different fashion. Against A3, the most popular move is D6. D6 leads to a very nice gambit and nice traps. I will mention one in passing here. If on D6 takes and white makes a normal move like knight to F3, and black develops a piece like this, let's say knight to C6. If white tries to play G3 and try to set up something normal with bishop to G2 and castle and be an extra pawn ahead, this of course loses to the well-known trap knight takes F2. And this forks the queen and the rook. So this must be accepted, but when it is accepted, it loses to bishop takes G3 check. And here we have a win of the queen. The bishop can be captured, but the queen cannot be protected. This line has claimed a lot of victims and can be quite nasty. The line I'm going to make a case for is again playing b6 and again trying to put the bishop on b7. This does not mean that we might not play d6 later on, but we're just simply not going to play it. We're just simply not going to play it now. All right, so here white can play in normal solid fashion. If they played knight f3, again we can get to this type of position, and again we have knight to c5 to e6, and we have sort of a conjoining of variations here. So and this is obviously present in this position. If white plays queen d5 with this particular fork, this one we can play knight to c5. Bishop to b7 has also been played before, but knight c5 is a little bit more accurate in my opinion. Knight c5 looks like it says, go ahead and take my rook. So when they capture the rook, now black actually sets the trap in a different way, or springs the trap rather, bishop to b7. Now that the bishop is protected, the only move to get out of this trap is to play queen takes pawn. And then, of course, we just simply develop the knight. And now we can be very thankful for the a3 move that they played, because white will not be able to back up to a3. And anywhere they go, the queen is lost. So now white does get a few pieces, a few points for this queen. So even if they capture the bishop and we get a position like this, it's very nice that we have an extra queen here for a rook and a knight. But a rook and a knight is still worth 8 points. And not only that, white still has all 8 pawns and we only have 6. So it turns out here that materially, points speaking, we're actually down in points, but the fact that we have our queen is rather nice. So I guess it would just be a matter of taste here. I don't know. I personally would like the extra queen. Also, the fact that white needs to catch up in development is, I would say black is definitely for choice here. The Fajarowicz variation of the Budapest Gambit. If you want to message me at Lee Chess, I am Bleorg, BLEEORG. If you want to show me your games, and in the future, I will do a video and show some of the viewers' games. So this has been Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School, and we shall see you on the next one.